Imagine returning home after 3 years away to find your family, over 100 people, completely vanished. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just a single word carved into a post. CROATOAN. This wasn't a movie plot. This was the reality John White faced in 1590 when he returned to Roanoke. For over 400 years, the fate of America's first English colony has remained one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Were they massacred? Did they join Native American tribes? Or was something more sinister at play? Today, we're examining all the evidence and theories to finally answer: where did the lost colony of Roanoke really go? That single word carved into the post wasn't random. Before leaving for England in 1587, John White made a specific agreement with the colonists. If they had to relocate, they would carve their destination into a tree or post. If they left under duress, they would add a Maltese cross. The absence of that cross suggests this wasn't a distress signal. CROATOAN referred to both a place and a people. Hatteras Island was called CROATOAN Island at the time, home to the Croatan tribe. These Native Americans had been allies of the colonists, particularly through their relationship with Manteo, a Croatan man who helped mediate between cultures. The word could have meant they moved there voluntarily, but why leave such an ambiguous message? Archaeologists have found intriguing evidence on Hatteras Island. Excavations revealed a 16th-century rapier hilt, English gun parts, and a slate writing tablet alongside Native American artifacts. These mixed items suggest cultural interaction rather than conflict. A copper ring discovered there bears an interesting connection. It matches other trade items from that era showing exchange between the groups. The colonists might have left Roanoke for practical reasons. By 1587, they'd been dependent on supply ships that failed to arrive. Moving 50 miles south to CROATOAN Island would put them closer to better fishing grounds and their native allies. The distance was manageable, 2 days by boat, and would explain why they left most structures dismantled rather than destroyed. Some argue the carving could have been a red herring. The word wasn't hidden. It stood prominently on a main post near the gate. If attackers forced them to leave this message, wouldn't that defeat the purpose? Alternatively, perhaps only some colonists left for CROATOAN while others met different fates. The complete lack of human remains at Roanoke remains troubling. The most straightforward interpretation remains the planned relocation theory. Written accounts from later English explorers mention meeting light-skinned natives who claimed European ancestry. John Lawson wrote in 1701 about Hatteras Indians who said their ancestors could talk in a book, potentially referring to literate colonists who joined them. Weather records from tree rings support this timeline. The late 1580s saw extreme drought conditions, making Roanoke less viable for farming. CROATOAN Island, surrounded by water, would offer better food security through fishing. This environmental pressure could explain their sudden departure when supplies ran low. Why didn't White find them when he reached CROATOAN? Rough seas prevented his ship from landing there in 1590. Subsequent English expeditions either didn't search properly or failed to recognize assimilated colonists decades later when styles of dress and living had changed. The evidence leans toward gradual integration rather than sudden disaster. But this raises new questions about their motivations. What conditions could drive English settlers to abandon their colonial identity entirely? To understand that, we need to examine their relationships with neighboring tribes. What if the colonists didn't vanish at all, but simply became part of another community? The assimilation theory suggests they joined local Native American tribes, particularly the Croatan people. This idea makes more sense when you consider their existing relationship. Monteo, a Croatan leader, had developed trust with the English. He'd traveled to England twice and helped mediate between the cultures. These connections might have become a lifeline when the colonists faced starvation and isolation. The evidence for integration comes from multiple directions. Oral histories from the Lumbee tribe tell of ancestors with European features. Some accounts describe grandparents with fair hair and light eyes, passed down through generations. These stories align with encounters English explorers had decades later. In 1701, John Lawson documented meeting Hatteras Indians, who claimed their ancestors could talk in a book, likely referring to reading English. While oral history isn't concrete proof, these consistent accounts suggest some truth behind them. Archaeological finds also hint at cultural mixing. Excavations have uncovered English artifacts in Native American sites, including a 16th-century signet ring and pieces of European weaponry. These weren't just trade goods. Some objects showed signs of being modified to suit native preferences. A broken English sword had been reshaped into a scraping tool. This demonstrates practical adaptation rather than mere possession of European items. Modern DNA studies attempt to find genetic links. Researchers have compared samples from modern Lumbee and other local tribes to English descendants of the Roanoke families. While some shared markers exist, establishing direct lineage remains difficult after so many generations. The genetic trail goes cold because both populations have mixed extensively over 4 centuries. Current testing methods can't definitively confirm ancestry from such a small historic group. People often ask why there isn't clearer evidence if assimilation occurred. Think about what integration actually looks like. The 115th colonists wouldn't have arrived as a unified group maintaining English customs. Scattered across different villages, they would have adopted local languages, marriage customs, and survival techniques. Within a generation or two, their descendants might not stand out visually or culturally. Without written records from the natives themselves, we're left with fragments. The practical challenges of survival explain why colonists might choose this path. Starvation makes cultural boundaries fade. European clothing and tools would wear out quickly in the Carolina wilderness. Native hunting and farming methods were better suited to the environment. Some may have resisted assimilation initially, but hunger and the need for protection would overcome those hesitations over time. Critics point out that no English graves or distinctly European-style settlements appeared in native villages. But this makes sense if integration was successful. Settlers adopting native practices wouldn't have maintained separate burial customs. The entire premise of assimilation means they stopped living as English colonists. Their material culture would become indistinguishable from their hosts within years. The lack of communication with England also fits this theory. Transatlantic messages required ships and motivation. Colonists who joined native communities had no system to send letters. Even if individuals wanted to reconnect, they'd lack the means. Over years, maintaining an English identity would become less important than daily survival in their new lives. Some intriguing possibilities emerge when we consider gender dynamics. The colony included women and children, groups more likely to be accepted into native societies than armed male invaders. Intermarriage would hasten genetic and cultural blending. Several native tribes in the region were matrilineal, meaning children of English fathers would still belong to the mother's clan. The question remains why no Europeans reported finding clearly identifiable colonists later. The simple answer might be that they didn't recognize them. After decades of living differently, speaking other languages, and dressing like natives, these individuals wouldn't have stood out. When English settlers returned years later, they expected to find fellow Englishmen, not people who had voluntarily abandoned that identity. Their own cultural biases might have made integration invisible to them. This theory explains much: the lack of bodies, the dismantled rather than destroyed buildings, and the CROATOAN clue. But it doesn't account for all possibilities. Not every encounter between colonists and natives was peaceful. The darkest possibility is that the colonists met a violent end. England and Spain were locked in a fierce rivalry during this period, competing for control of the New World. Spanish forces had reason to target Roanoke. Eliminating England's foothold in America would strengthen Spain's claims to the continent. Spanish naval records show they were actively monitoring English colonial efforts, making them aware of Roanoke's location and weakness. Tensions with some local tribes add another layer of danger. While the colonists had good relations with the CROATOAN, other groups like the CROATOAN had clashed with them. The CROATOAN leader Wingina had been killed by English soldiers just a year before the disappearance. His followers may have sought revenge against the vulnerable colony when White departed. Physical evidence could support this theory, but it's frustratingly ambiguous. The fort at Roanoke was dismantled rather than destroyed when White returned. Wooden posts had been carefully removed, not broken. Was this salvage work by departing colonists reusing materials, or did attackers systematically disassemble the structures? Either interpretation fits the evidence. The complete absence of human remains raises questions. If a massacre occurred, why no bones? But consider the local environment. Acidic coastal soils can dissolve bones within decades. Any skeletal remains might have completely decomposed in the 4 centuries since. Alternatively, attackers could have disposed of bodies at sea or in mass graves that haven't been found. Spanish records from the period contain intriguing hints. A 1588 document mentions the Spanish knew the English had established a settlement on the Florida coast, likely referring to Roanoke. Another account describes plans to root out English colonists if found. But no Spanish source directly claims responsibility for attacking Roanoke. The CROATOAN carving itself could have been a red herring. If attackers forced the colonists to leave this message, it would misdirect searchers. The lack of a Maltese cross might indicate they never had time to complete the agreed distress signal. Others think the colonists could have carved it honestly before being ambushed elsewhere. Evidence against this theory stands out as well. No Spanish artifacts from the period have been found at Roanoke. If Spanish soldiers attacked, why didn't they leave behind any weapons, armor, or personal items? Native American artifacts found at the site show no clear signs of battle damage either. English accounts from later expeditions complicate the picture. In the 1600s, Jamestown settlers heard stories from local tribes about sightings of European-descended people living inland. If some colonists survived for decades after 1587, it weakens the theory of total annihilation. Climate evidence provides another angle. Tree rings show the region suffered extreme drought between 1587 to 1589. If Spanish raiders or hostile tribes attacked, they'd find a colony already weakened by famine and thirst. This environmental stress might have made them unable to mount an effective defense. The time delay works against this theory too. 3 years passed between White's departure and return. If violence occurred immediately after he left, why didn't later English expeditions find more definitive evidence? An early massacre seems less likely than a gradual dispersal over time. While plausible, the violent end theory lacks smoking gun evidence. No weapons, no mass graves, no definitive first-hand accounts pin the blame on any particular group. The Spanish certainly had motive and opportunity, but so far no concrete proof ties them directly to the disappearance. Nature itself presents another possible culprit we've yet to examine. Sometimes the deadliest threats aren't human enemies, but environmental forces beyond anyone's control. If drought could weaken a colony, what other natural disasters might have sealed its fate? The colony's fate may have been decided not by human hands, but by forces no one could control. Tree rings from bald cypress trees in the region tell a sobering story. The years 1587 to 1589 show some of the narrowest growth rings recorded in the past 800 years, proof of an extreme drought. These growth patterns indicate rainfall was nearly 40% below normal during the colonists' most critical years. When you rely on crops to survive, that kind of prolonged dryness doesn't just make life difficult, it makes it impossible. Imagine what this meant practically. Corn, their staple crop, requires consistent moisture. Without rain, fields would have produced meager harvests, if any. Game animals would have migrated away from the parched area. Even freshwater sources around Roanoke Island would have diminished, turning creeks to mud and wells brackish. Famine doesn't just weaken bodies, it weakens social bonds. Starvation could explain why the group might have fragmented, with some risking movement to find food while others stayed behind. Disease likely compounded these struggles. European settlers lacked immunity to New World pathogens, while simultaneously introducing devastating illnesses to native populations. Smallpox hadn't yet reached the area, but dysentery from contaminated water or vitamin deficiencies like scurvy could have spread through malnourished colonists. Modern studies of Jamestown's starving time show mortality rates exceeding 80% during similar conditions. If Roanoke faced comparable hardship, it explains why no mass graves were found. Few may have survived long enough to bury the dead properly. The drought's timing was disastrous. It peaked just as White left for England in 1587. By the time he returned in 1590, the colonists would have endured 3 growing seasons with failed crops. This matches archaeological evidence showing the colonists expanded their search for food. Oyster shell deposits suggest they increasingly relied on shellfish, a starvation diet low in nutrients. Such desperation makes their actions more understandable. Relocating to CROATOAN Island wouldn't have been a choice so much as a last resort, since coastal areas offered better access to fish and shellfish when land-based food failed. The environmental theory also explains confusing details. The dismantled buildings suggest an orderly departure rather than a panicked flight. Colonists may have carefully salvaged usable materials to rebuild elsewhere. The CRO marking found on a tree could have been an unfinished message, perhaps carved by weakened survivors unable to complete it. Tree ring data even shows the drought briefly eased in 1589, which might have allowed some to attempt an ill-fated escape by boat when rains returned. Native groups weren't immune to these conditions either. The same drought would have strained their food supplies, making them less able to assist the colonists. This puts their later accounts of English descendants into perspective, helping starving refugees in small numbers over years would leave a subtler genetic trace than a sudden mass integration. Modern climate studies reveal how fragile early colonies were. Research on Jamestown shows that even with more supplies and experience, later settlers still faced 50% mortality during dry years. Roanoke had neither advantage. The drought's severity made failure nearly inevitable. The real mystery isn't why they disappeared, but how any might have survived. Their potential survival strategies reflect human resilience. Splitting into smaller groups would have increased some individuals' chances of finding food. Younger, healthier members might have traveled to trade with distant tribes for corn. Some likely succumbed to starvation, while others found temporary sanctuary, explaining why physical evidence is scattered rather than concentrated in one place. The environmental angle doesn't rule out other theories. It contextualizes them. Drought could have forced colonists to seek help from the CROATOAN, turning voluntary integration into a necessity. Starvation might have made them vulnerable to attack by rivals searching for dwindling resources. But without the drought's pressure, the colony might have held on until resupply came. This raises an unsettling question. Was their disappearance ultimately nature's doing rather than human action? If so, the real tragedy isn't that they vanished without explanation, but that a simple shift in weather patterns doomed England's first American settlement. Their story becomes less about a mystery and more about humanity's fragile early attempts to colonize an unfamiliar land. The evidence suggests the truth combines several theories. The severe drought likely pushed desperate colonists to seek help from the CROATOAN, their most reliable allies. Most probably integrated with this tribe, explaining the CROATOAN clue and European artifacts found on Hatteras Island. A smaller group may have moved inland, accounting for the CRO carving and later reports of European-descended natives further west. This isn't just a historical mystery. It's a story of survival. Facing starvation, the colonists made difficult choices. Their disappearance reflects early America's complex cultural exchanges, where desperate circumstances forced unlikely alliances. What's your theory? Share below and check our sources for deeper exploration.